Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin Nun Zayin. We were in the middle of complicated mathematical calculations, all about this one line. Again, we had segued into the Arei Leviim, where we learned certain halachot about Eruv Tchumin, but really it's a separate topic of the Levite cities. We talked about that the Levites didn't get their own portion in the land, and there they got 48 cities that were smack in the middle of other people's territory. So it was very important. If you're a regular person, you have, your whole shevet, your tribe has lots of territory. You don't need to define around each city whose territory is it. The whole thing is your territory. But when you have a city smack in the middle of somebody else's territory, then you need to know exactly what the borders are. So again, the Torah tells you we get 1,000. They each get 1,000 amot around of empty space. That was for decorative purposes, so that it's not, too crowded when you walk out of the city. And then the 2,000 is going to be for planting, okay? Or it's not the 2,000, it's just another 1,000. And then instead of saying, well, you have 1,000 and 2,000, 1,000 is a half of 2,000, they said 1,000 is a quarter of 2,000. And then we had a big debate trying to figure out what exactly how do you get from 1,000 to 2,000 being a quarter? Okay, so once you have the squares, you realize why it's definitely not half, because one is 1,000 immediately and the other one's 2,000 around, which is obviously bigger. But the question is, how did we get to those measurements? And both Rav and Abai gave different explanations. We said one of the differences was that Abai didn't include the city in his calculation, and Rav did. And both of them basically made the city a circle. And then the migrash was also circular, because again, we'd rather have you have more space when it comes to the planting space. And that's why we kept the city and the migrash around it, the empty space, smaller, and then gave them more, right? Then they squared it off only in the tchum, okay? In the boundary of the city where you were allowed to plant more stuff. Okay, so we ended up with either 9 out of 36 or 6 out of 24, depending on whether your city, the main difference between Rabbi and Rav also was your city, was it a city of 2,000 amma that we were talking about, 2,000 by 2,000, or again, rounded, but with a 2,000 diameter, or was it 1,000 according to Abai? Now we're gonna have two more explanations. Ravina Amar, my Revia de Tchumin. Okay, what does he say? Okay, let's look at our pictures. We're now at picture number 207. No, picture number, 208. Until now, we kept saying, if we're talking 1,000 around and then 2,000 around, you have the space that is up against the city, okay? Meaning if your city's 2,000 amma, then you're gonna go out 1,000 amma at a width of 2,000. But then we kept adding these corners in, right? Because then you end up with these 4 spaces that looks kind of like a plus sign. But what about squaring it off? So we kept squaring it off and adding the corners. So comes Ravina and he says, what are you talking about squaring it off? We only want the tchuim part, meaning we're talking about just if you have a city of 2,000 by 2,000, we want the space that's right next to the city. That's the quarter that we're talking about, meaning the migrash, the empty space is only going to be a section of, you're going to go out 1,000 amma. Since the city is 2,000 amma width, you're going to go out 2,000 width by 1,000 in 4 spaces in all 4 directions, and you're not going to get the corners. So how much is that going to give you? So each square, you're going to have 4 squares of 2,000 by 1,000. So each is 2 million square cubits. So you're going to end up with 8 million square cubits. Now, what's going to be a quarter then? Out of 32. Where was 32? That was the very beginning of Rava. We counted all these squares around the whole 2,000 space without the city. Because remember, then we said it doesn't match 12 out of 32. And then they said, oh, it must be 12 out of 36. They said, oh, that's still only a third. But they included 36 included the city. If you exclude the city and you just talk about the outside space, then these 4 areas are basically going to be a quarter of the entire space around the city. Okay, so it's going to be, again, 8 out of 32. That's a quarter. Rav Ashi Amar, my Revia, he's going to say the exact opposite, Revia de Kranot. He says, forget that. You don't get the space immediately next to the city. Those don't have to be left empty. What part do you leave empty? The corners, the 4 corners that are within 1,000 cubits, right? You draw these 1,000 cubits by 1,000 cubits, 1,000 amma by 1,000 amma squares in the corners. It's specifically whatever Ravina didn't measure. He said that is the only space you get. And anything next to the city, those squares, that's all considered plantable space. And all you get are these four corners. Now, so what's the quarter? Well, this is a little different than what we've seen until now. Each corner, you could say it in two ways. Each corner here is a quarter of the full corner of the 2,000. Remember, you get 2,000 amma around the city, and the 1,000 is within this 2,000. So now we're going to say, the corner that you get is a quarter of the entire corner, or all four corners that you get are a quarter of the entire four corners that you get for planting. Okay, so you can see that from the picture very easily here in the red. You see there's a blue square, that's the corner that you get, and that's a quarter of the corner, the whole corner that exists there. Okay, so that's Rav Ashi. We're now going to have a slew of questions about some of the opinions that we saw. Okay, again, why is this empty space important? It's purely for beauty purposes or for use of the city, right? To have some empty space. It just looks nice. If you have everything crowded in and you walk out of your city and you're immediately walking into fields, right? It's not so easy to get around. It's just ugly to have everything crowded in. You know, a lot of us in Israel know that because everything's right on top of everything else, right? It just looks prettier if you have empty spaces. So, right, often cities have empty spaces before. So again, why is it only for the Levite cities? All the other cities also probably have space around them. It's just that the Levite cities, they lived within a territory of somebody else. And it was very important to demarcate how much space everyone gets. Okay, wait till the next Mishnah. We're going to see about all the cities having space around them, and we'll get back to that. Okay, so now we're going to get to some questions. So first, Ravina asked Rav Ashi a question on Rav Ashi's opinion. That was the last one about the corners. Amalei Ravina le Rav Ashi. V'has saviv ktiv. It says surrounding the city. What do you think surrounding the city means? Surrounding the city, not the corners, right? It's a strange opinion that he mentions. It said in the pasuk there that they get 1,000 amma around. Around sounds like up against the city. So he says, no, my saviv de kranot. What do you mean? Corners could be also around. It's surrounding. It's not directly around, but it's surrounding. And now he further proves it from the Beit HaMikdash world. Okay, he says, when it comes time for the korban olah, the burnt offering, what does it say? You put the blood on the altar around. Now, do you go around the altar and put blood all around the altar? No. How do you do it? Hachanami saviv mamash. What? There you go all around? No. Elamai saviv de kanot. You go around the mizbech and you put it on the corners of the mizbech. We're going to get all this in Tzvachim about how, Shtaim Shem Arba and all different kinds, or how many times do you do the blood on which corners, etc. But that's not our issue right now. But the main point is there were these four corners on the altar, and you would go around and put this on the altars. So therefore, they say, Hachanamis, so there it's Saviv de Kranot. Hachanami, my Saviv de Kranot. Okay, so also here, it would be Saviv of the Kranot. Okay, that's what it means, to the corners. Amale Rav Chavivi mechozna'a Rav Ashi. V'ha'ika morsha de Kranata. Okay, just to say before we even start, this is not a question on Rav Ashi. He's asking Rav Ashi a question, but he's asking Rav Ashi a question on Rava and Abaye. So if you remember, one of the main differences between Rava and Abaye and Ravina and Rav Ashi was about the size of the city. The shape of the city, was it round or was it square? So Rav Chavivi Mechozna asked Rav Ashi, if you're talking about that the city was round, he says, but wait a minute, don't you have morsha de karnata? Even if this, now this is a bit of a strange question, and Rav Ashi is going to understand it even more strangely, but he's basically saying, we talked about there that the city's round, and this is how we drew it as a circle. I'm now in picture 210. And then we said that the tchum is 1,000 amma around, right? The migrash, the empty space, as a round circle, we drew it. And then, right, we calculated the area of this entire circle of the 1,000 amma around. And then we said, then in addition, there's a square around it. But he says, don't we view this, isn't the city a square? So how do you get it round? And it's a little bit strange what his question is. We'll see in a minute what it is. But Rav Ashi answers him right away. What are you talking about? B'mata igulta. No, the city was round. The city wasn't square. Why are you asking, what about the square of the city? What he's basically asking is, and if you look at this yellow dotted line, in between the yellow frame of the city and the yellow dotted line is some space. Now, if you make a yellow dotted line of a square around a circle, there's going to be space in there. Now, when we calculated the area of the circle of the 1,000 circle amma around, I would say like the donut shape because it's got a hole in the middle of the city, but the shape around it, we included in there the corners of some imaginary square that we draw around the city. But he's saying, isn't that part considered part of the city? So Rav Ashi thought he meant, isn't the city a square? And Rav Ashi says, what are you talking about? The city is a circle. See, so now he says, no, I know the city is a circle. That wasn't my question. But don't they square off the city? Just like when we calculated 2,000 cubits around the city, right? When we calculate now the 2,000 cubits, when we talked about it with Tchum Shabbat, we had a round city. What do we always say? We square off the city. So aren't we squaring off this city also when we calculate the 2,000 around the city, right? Ultimately, we end up with this big square. Remember, that was, if you look at this top picture, right? We have the circle of the city, the circle of the migrash, and then we have a big square around it. In order to get to that square, don't we square off the city? So if we square off the city, again, that space, those little corners there, like in the picture here, right? Those little corners are going to be considered part of the city and not part of the migrash. And when you calculated that reva, you calculated that space as part of the migrash. So what did they answer? No, he says, we said we view it as if we square off the city in order to get to the 2,000 cubits around the city, but we don't actually square off the city. No, again, there's the city that's round and there's the tchum, the migrash around it that's round. And then we square it off. We view the city as square in order to come up with all these measurements, but we don't actually square off the city. And it also makes sense because this space, if we square off the city, we're only squaring it in an imaginary manner. Nobody's building there, right? It's still empty space. So of course it counts as part of this migrash that was empty space. So therefore, that's not really much of a question. Okay, so again, it was a bit of a strange question. Likewise, this next one's going to be quite a strange question. It's going to show that somebody didn't know so much about mathematics. Okay, so when you hear this question, you might say, what on earth are they talking about? Don't worry, because it really doesn't make mathematical sense. And that's in the end what they're going to answer. And by the way, there's clear proof from this sugya that they all knew the Pythagorean, or not all, but some of them knew the Pythagorean theorem. And that makes sense because Pythagoras lived in, I think it was the 5th century BCE. So basically that existed way before their time and they knew about it. So we're going to get to that. Now, Amar Rav Chanilai Mechoz Na'a LeRav Ashi. Again, he asked the question on Rava and Abai and this circle. And what did we say? Michti kama meruba yeter ala igul. How much is a square bigger than a circle? What did we say? Revia. We say a quarter more. Nachon? Okay, so now he says your whole number. Now go back to the beginning of yesterday's daf. What did we talk about? That when you draw the squares for the tchum, we're now back to tchum. When you draw the squares of the tchum Shabbat, what did we say? You don't draw a diagonal of 2,000. You draw, right, a hypotenuse. You draw a square. Each side is 2,000 and the hypotenuse is going to be 2,800. But now he says, he wants to say that basically, just like we said that a circle is always less than the square. Now, theoretically, what are we really doing? If you draw a line of 2,000 amma, and we saw a picture of this yesterday, that the 2,000 is going to end, there's like an imaginary circle around where you basically draw lines out of your circle of your city or out of your square of your city. You draw lines all around. You basically end up with a circle of 2,000 amma, and then you square it off and you end up getting the angles. That's how we viewed it, right? That it was kind of like there's a circle, go out 2,000 every direction, and then you square it off, and that's how you get to 2,800. But if all these squares are a quarter more than the circles, then the number of 800, remember we said you get 400 of the inner circle, and then you get 800 of the outer circle. That 800 is a wrong number, they say. Okay, Hane Timnemea, it shouldn't be 800, because 800 to 2,000 is not, 2,800 to 2,000 is not a quarter more. They're basically saying we should use that formula for here also. So it should be sheet me'av sheetim b'sheva nechitilta. It should be 667 minus a third, right? Basically 666.67, right? Or 6 with a bar, right? Okay, now, how do we get to that number? Okay, so you can get to it two ways. But the easiest way is to say, if you take the number 2,666.67, which is what they're suggesting, then you divide that by 4, you're going to get to 666.67. So if you take away 666.67 from 2,666.67, you're going to get to 2,000. So basically they're saying, shouldn't the hypotenuse be a quarter more when it's outside the circle, right, than inner part of the circle? Okay, remember, that's if I draw this imaginary circle and they all go out 2,000 amma. So that's his question, which really shows he doesn't understand so much about mathematics, but he's saying, if that's your mathematical formula, then it should work here too. So Amarle, here comes his answer. That's when you have a circle and a square. I'll say this in other words. That's when we're trying to figure out the area, right? This is an area that we're calculating here. The area of a circle compared to a square is 3/4. That's all based on, their estimation of pi, that it was 3 and not 3.14, blah, 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 blah. Okay, but that's there, okay? It's the area. But when we're talking about hypotenuse, it comes out more than that. Okay, da'amar, how do we know this? Because somebody says, and this is the Pythagorean theorem, or it's based on it, any amma squared, any cubit squared, right, a square cubit, is 2 chumashim, it's a amma v'trei chumshe ba'alachsona. It's 1 2/5 on the diagonal, right, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. 1 squared plus 1 squared equals, right, we're going to have 2. The square root of 2 it's actually 1.414, and it goes on for a while, that number, but we'll cut it off at 1.414, which is basically close enough, at least in the Gemara world, right? That's close enough to 1.4, which is 1 2/5. Okay, so that's how they say basically it's based on Pythagorean theorem, and it's not, right? That's our formula that we came up with was an area formula and not the diagonal, the hypotenuse. Okay, moving on. This connects a little and goes back to some questions that were asked before, which is Notnim karpaf le'ir divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says every city gets a karpaf. Okay, what does that mean? He means that basically when we come to measuring the city and we measure 2,000 cubits, we don't measure from the border of the city. We already talked about ma'abrina te'ir, right? Where sometimes you'll stretch the borders of the city. Some people say that if you already stretch the borders of the city, then you count directly from there, even according to Rabbi Meir. There's a bit of a debate about this. Some people say, no, even in that case, where you've stretched the borders a little because there were things jutting out, you still get an additional, according to Rabbi Meir, you get 70 2/3 amma, that's this karpaf. You get 70 2/3 cubits outside the city. So someone asked, why only the Arei Leviim? Here also, every city, it's not the same amount, but every city gets a little bit of empty space outside their city that belongs to their city. Where do we get to the 70 2/3 amma amount? I don't know if you remember, we talked about in the beginning of the Masechet. And this maybe explains why we get this. It comes from the courtyard of the Mishkan. Remember the courtyard of the Mishkan was 100 by 50, 5,000 square cubits. So 70 2/3 is basically that same number, just in a square. Okay, it's the same amount. It's just 70 2/3 by 70 2/3 is close to 5,000 cubits. Okay, 5,000 square cubits. So basically what they say is that every city kind of has its own, the city's courtyard around the city. And the size of a city courtyard is 70 2/3, like the Mishkan. And therefore, we're going to say that we're going to now give everybody, before we start measuring the 2,000 cubits outside the city, first we're going to give you 70 2/3, and then we're going to start measuring. And that's why every time we have something that's within 70 2/3, like some sort of house or something else, we keep extending the border. Because and that's this whole thing they would put up, we're going to see this later, borganim, huts, all throughout to basically permit people to walk from place to place. As long as they're within 70 2/3, you're good. Chachamim omrim, lo amru karpaf, ela ben shtei ayarot. Chachamim say, no. That's not true. You don't measure from the karpaf. You measure from the border of the city. The whole thing about this karpaf is to determine between two cities, are these two separate cities Or are they two cities that are next to each other? Do we count this as one big city? If we count it as one big city, what he's saying is the whole idea of a karpaf and the 70 and 2/3 measurement is not to measure from a city. No, it's if I have two cities. Okay, I'll give a good example, and this will help me for later. I don't know if everyone's familiar with these cities, but I am because I live in Ra'anana. So if you have, basically there's like a straight line. There's Ra'anana in the middle. There's Herzliya on one side and Kfar Saba on the other. So right now, let's just talk about Ra'anana and Kfar Saba. They're right next to each other. And what they want to say is, if you don't have a karpaf, or maybe two karpafs, it's not so clear yet what he's saying. If you don't have a space of a karpaf, or maybe two, and there's a karpaf from outside each city in between each other, or maybe just one karpaf in between, 70 and 2/3, then we're going to view these two cities as together. So if it's 70 and 2/3 exactly, then they're going to be considered together, or maybe 141 and a third, which we'll see. It's unclear what he means yet, and we're going to see in a minute. This next line is unclear. This could be Chachamim, it could be Rabbi Meir. Right now, sounds like Rabbi Meir would agree with Chachamim about the cities. Also, it's just the Chachamim don't agree with Rabbi Meir about that we measure 70 and 2/3 outside every city. Chachamim just say, no, the 70 and 2/3 is that if I want to say, are these two cities one or two separate cities, then the 70 and 2/3 plays. If there's more than one or two karpifot in between the cities, then we're going to view them as two separate cities. If there's less, we're going to view them all as one city, which means if I'm on one side of Ra'anana, I can walk 2,000 cubits from the other side of Kfar Saba, basically. I have all that space because we're considered one city. Im yesh lezo 70 ama b'shirayim, ulezo 70 ama b'shirayim, oseh karpafet shtehen liot echad. So if my city has 70 and 2/3 and the other city has 70 and 2/3, that's the number that's allowed. Anything more than that would be a problem. But if we have that number, we can all, or less, we can be one city. Okay, so like I said, it's unclear whether the rabbis say it or whether Rabbi Meir. We're going to get to all that in the Gemara. What if you have, like I said, Ra'anana, Kfar Saba, Herzliya? So Ra'anana is right in the center, and there's kind of a line of these cities. If the space in between Ra'anana on both sides to Kfar Saba and Herzliya is not more than 70 and 2/3, right? Altogether, it's not more than 141 and a third, which is double that amount that we just said, the 70 and 2/3. If it's not more than that amount, then you can go from Herzliya all the way to Kfar Saba and then 2,000 cubits. Okay, so you get everything. So im yesh ben shnayim chitzonim 141 u'shlish, asa emtza'it shloshan liot echad. The middle one combines the two outer ones. Okay, we're gonna have to understand what exactly this means also, because it sounds like it's not really adding so much. If it was two cities, we'd say these were all one. So why have to say it with three? We'll get to that in the Gemara. So the Gemara starts off with Rabbi Meir. You get a karpaf around your city, 70 and 2/3 cubits. Minani mile, where do you get this from? This is where there's the crossover between the Levite cities and the psukim about those and our cities. So minani mile amar Rava d'Amarcha mikir ha'ir v'chutza. Okay, it said you measure the migrash from the wall of the city and out. So they say amra Torah tein chutza v'achar kach medod. So he understands it as first you get a chutza and then you start measuring. In other words, every city has a bit extra in the city. That's how they read the word chutza. As opposed to reading it, the simple reading is, no, that is the chutza. The 1,000 is the chutza. But here it sounds like there's a chutza, and then you measure. Etc. So again, here comes the disagreement of the rabbis, and now the debate becomes, what did the rabbis think? Itmar. Here's an intro to a machlok and a moraim. Okay, and for this, there's a chart on the second side of the sheet. Okay, we're going to have, just to give you the structure, first a question of Rav Huna and an answer. Then we're going to have a question on Rav Chia bar Rav, and then we're going to go back and have another question on Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says, Nutnim karpaf lezo ukarpaf lezo. You get two, one for each city. So in other words, if Ra'anana and Kfar Saba are separated by 141 and 2 1/3, that's going to be fine. That even though that's a big space, because it's each city has its own space, and then we view them as combined because it's not any more than that. Any more than that would be a problem. But if it's 80, right, and you only have one karpaf's worth, then for sure they're combined, okay? It's only more than two karpaf's worth, it's going to be an issue. But Chia bar Rav amar karpaf echad l'shtehen. No, you only get one 70 and 2/3 in between these two cities. If there's more than one, then already it's not going to work. Tnan. So now they're going to question Rav Huna from the Mishnah. Chachamim omrim lo amru karpaf. Notice the word he uses. They didn't say karpaf. Notice he says singular, one karpaf. Ela ben shtei ayarot, other than between two cities. It sounds like he means singular. To Yufta de Rav Huna, because Rav Huna said it's two. It should have said karpifot. So they say, no, that's not true. Amar lecha Rav Huna, he could answer, my karpaf, torat karpaf. He meant the topic of karpaf. He wasn't talking about a single karpaf. He meant the issue of a karpaf, which means you need two karpifot, right? Or you could have two karpifot and still view them as together. He just meant the rules of karpaf, not how many. He didn't mean how many. Ulo olam, karpaf lazo, and it clearly means one for each. How do we know this? From the next line. Hachinami mistaber, and as I said, it's unclear how we read that line, but right now we're going to read that line as if it's a continuation of Chachamim. Im yesh lezo shivim ama b'shirayim ulezo shivim ama b'shirayim oseh karpaf l'shtehem liot echad. That's exactly what, right, Chachamim say. Basically, they're saying it's between two cities, and then we start saying, well, then how do we measure it? Karpaf for you, and then we can still view you as one as long as there's up to and not more than a karpaf for each. So they view that Shema Mina, and that's Rav Huna's proof. Well, if that's a good proof for Rav Huna that that's what that line means, so then lematavi tiyuvta de Chiya bar Rav, then this should be a contradiction to Chiya bar Rav, because if the rabbis say that, then it must mean that's what the rabbis meant, that you need two karpifot. So how could he say one karpaf between two cities? And no, right, any more than that, already we're going to consider them two separate cities. So Amar lecha Chiya bar Rav, Hamani Rabbi Meir. Oh, that line, that's Rabbi Meir. That's not the rabbis. And that's how I set it up before when we read the Mishnah. So they say, wait a minute. Rabbi Meir, okay, so now how do you read the Mishnah? Let's just go back for a minute. The Mishnah reads, Rabbi Meir says you get a karpaf, everyone gets a karpaf outside their city. Then Chachamim say, no. That's only for two cities that are next to each other. Then, according to Chiya bar Rav, one karpaf, right, is going to mean if it's more than 70 2/3, we're already going to view them as two separate cities. Comes in Rabbi Meir and says, wait, no, I disagree with you about that. I think im yesh lezo shivim ama b'shirayim ulezo shivim ama b'shirayim oseh karpaf shteen liot echad. Only if you have two karpifot and more than that are you going to consider these two separate cities. Now that works in perfectly with Rabbi Meir's approach, because Rabbi Meir says each city gets its own 70 2/3 before you even start measuring the tchum, which means that if we have two nearby cities, of course each city is going to have their own. If it's so obvious what I just said though, then why would you need to say it? If already he says in the first line, every city gets 70 2/3, then obviously if we have two cities next to each other, each one's going to get their 70 2/3. And if we have that amount or less, we're going to obviously view them as connected. So if that line is coming to say Rabbi Meir, hatana leresha, we already learned that in the first line. We could infer it very easily from the first line where it says, notnim karpaf le'ir divrei Rabbi Meir. So now they're going to have to explain tzricha. No, you wouldn't necessarily have known it. The fact that he talks about it with one city, that each city gets 70 2/3, and only after that you start to measure, doesn't necessarily mean he would say it when it's two cities next to each other. Why? You might have thought one city gets 70 2/3 space around it. If you have two cities next to each other, maybe that same 70 2/3 would be the magic number also. Maybe you would just say, okay, so if we have between two cities, that amount of space that you would normally have outside of one city, maybe he would have thought that 1 for 2 would be the amount also. Therefore, it has to say also, that's why that later line came in Rabbi Meir's name to say, Kamash Malan dilatarte treya haviname, that no, if you have two cities, each one gets their own, it wouldn't have been obvious. So now they're going to obviously say, why don't you just say the second line? If you had said it just by the two cities, it wouldn't, right? If each city gets its 70 2/3 when they're together, obviously when they're separated, each one's going to get 70 2/3. So why would you need to say that? So when you have two cities next to each other, each one kind of scrambles for that empty space in between the two cities, right? They want it for themselves because they're living in close quarters to another city, and each kind of wants their empty space because they need it because there's another city right there. So therefore, you might have thought, we're going to then say 70 2/3 for you and 70 2/3 for me. But let's say you live in some settlement out in the middle of nowhere and you have a lot of space around you. So your 70 2/3 aren't so important to you because you have lots of space anyway and you're not living in close quarters like that. So maybe, maybe you wouldn't get the 70 and 2/3 because maybe it's not so important to you. You don't really use it. Again, this goes back to what's the use of this space, right? Is it just for beauty? Is it also just for some breathing space? Is it to have a little extra? So therefore, you might not have thought that you'd get it in a regular city that's not surrounded by other cities. And therefore, Rabbi Meir needed to say it in both ways. And that's how Rav Chia bar Rav has to read the Mishnah, that third line, right? There's the first line, Rabbi Meir, second line, Chachamim, and then we go back to Rabbi Meir without really saying that we go back to Rabbi Meir, but that's how he reads it. Okay, now we're going to bring another question on Rav Huna from the Mishnah. Tnan. V'chein shlosha kfarim hameshulashim. Okay, this is that what we talked about. Again, I'll show you the picture. We have 3 cities right next to each other, okay? And, right, so again, I'll use the Kfar Saba, Ranana, Herzliya example. If when we measure the 2 spaces on both sides of Ranana and we have altogether less than 141 1/3, then if we have that amount or less, then we can view these all as one city and use it for Eruv. So now, what do they derive from here? Tamadika emtsai. It sounds like because there's 3 and there's a middle one, the middle one can combine. But haleka emtsai. What if there wasn't an emtsai and there was 141 1/3 in between? It would sound like only because there's 3 and I guess less than 141 in each empty space, therefore we combine them all. But if it were just 2, it sounds like 141 1/3 wouldn't be our magic number, which again goes against Rav Huna, who said that's our magic number between 2 cities because each city gets 70 and 2/3. So therefore, halekam say low, and therefore it would be tiyufta to Rav Huna. So now they say, no, you misunderstood the case. And the Mishnah, Rav Huna says, it's not Ranana, Kfar Saba, Herzliya. It's a bad example. Because why? Because those are in a straight line with each other. If they're in a straight line with each other, even 2, it would be 141 1/3. That's the magic number according to Rav Huna. But Amar Lacha Rav Huna would say, Ha'it Marala, wasn't it said about that Mishnah? Amar Rav bar Rav Idi, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Lo meshulashim mamash, Ella, it's not that the 3 are in a row. Ella, look at picture number 212. Ella ro'in kol she'ilu matil emtsai benehem v'yu meshulashim ve'en ben ze leze Ella 140 ama ve'echat v'shlish asa emtsai shloshan liot echad. We're talking about, and this really sounds like a triangle, where the cities aren't in a straight line. They're in a triangle formation. The word meshulash means triangle. What it means is, okay, rowing. Rowing means we view it as if. Imagine that Ranana moves a certain amount of space northward, okay, because they're on a line of east-west, and these 3 cities, and it moves all the way to the north, and it's not opposite, and you end up with this empty space where Ranana is right now, of just empty space in between Herzliya and Kfar Saba. So now you would end up, right, if you would we kind of imagine as if we could move Ranana south to be in between them. And if we were to, again, this is all in an imaginary world, we obviously can't move a city. If we were to move the city that way, and then when we measure the distance between the cities, we'd end up with 141 1/3 that altogether of space, then we would combine, that would help us to combine Kfar Saba and Herzliya, even though there's a huge amount of empty space in between them, okay? That's what it is. So now, that has nothing to do with 2 cities that are next to each other then. This is something entirely different. And then this isn't a question on Rav Huna. Okay, that's basically his answer. Now that we already said this question, I see people are already asking this in the chat. It's the obvious question to come up, which is, how much distance could Ranana move far north that we would still consider this together? Our classic 2,000 cubits. If it's more than 2,000 cubits already, then we're not going to view this one. But wait a minute, he says, Tim, okay? So Rava says to Abaye the following question. Now they say, but wait, Abaye, you said in the case of the rainbow-shaped city, remember that? And you held like the opinion that said, remember there was a debate, could it be that you have from the top of the rainbow, right, where you end up without inhabitants, all the way down to the imaginary line that we're going to draw at the bottom of the rainbow? Could there be more than 2,000 cubits or not? And you're the one who said, so how could you say here that this can't be? This is basically the same idea. There's uninhabited space, but because there's inhabited space some distance away, we can view it as if it's inhabited here. So why in the rainbow case did you say it could be more than 2,000. And here you said it can't be more than 2,000. So they say, oh, hachi hashti, you're comparing apples and oranges. Hatam ika batim, hachaleka batim. There, remember, the whole reason he said it could be more than 2,000 cubits is because you don't have to go through the uninhabited space. You could keep walking through the city till you get to the bottom of the rainbow. There's inhabited space in between. Here we're talking about cities where there's nothing in between. There's no space to walk from Ranana to those cities. And that's why it doesn't work. Now they're going to ask another question. Okay, first we dealt with the distance of how far could Ranana be from, right, the line between the two of them. But, right, and how far can we imaginarily move it? Now the question is, how far away can Kfar Saba and Herzliya be, right, in the other direction? Could they be really far away from each other and it would still work, assuming Ranana fills up the space and there's still not 141, right, more than 141 and 2/3, but could it be a huge distance? Right? Let's say Ranana is a gigantic city. So, Kam Yehe ben Chitzon lechitzon. So he says, Kam Yehe. What do you mean, Kam Yehe? That's exactly what the Mishnah said. My nafka lachmina. What's different? Kol she'ilu machnis and sa'i benehem. Bein ben zel lezel me'abar bein be'achat u'shlish. The Mishnah already said it. What do you mean? You stick Ranana back in an imaginary world. And then if it doesn't have 141 width, that's your width. It's whatever the city is plus 141 and 2/3. So he says, no. What I'm asking is, afilu arba'ata lafim ama, even if it's more than 4,000 cubits. Now, why is 4,000 cubits the imaginary number, the magic number? Because, again, we talked about this with the rainbow. If the two sides of the rainbow are more than 4,000 cubits away, it's a problem because there's no overlap of tchum. If it's less than 4,000, then the tchum of Herzliya will overlap with the tchum of Kfar Saba, and then we can say that. So would it work if it's even more? Amar le'in, he says, yes, even if it's more. So they say, Vahama Rav Huna, but you said when it came to the rainbow, Rav Huna said, Ir hasuya kekeshet im yesh ben shnei rasha pachot me'arba'at alafim ama modidim la min yeter v'im lav modidim la min keshet. You can't measure it from that imaginary line if the two sides of the rainbow are farther away than 4,000 cubits. So again, they have to come up with the difference between the two cases. Amar le hatam leika lememar male hacha ika lememar male. When you have a city built in a rainbow shape, the assumption is no one's going to be inhabiting that empty space. It was built like this for a reason. We don't really know why it would be built that way, but maybe this land is just not inhabited land. No one's going to move in there. That's and really the way I saw it explained is that if you're going to expand the city, where you're going to expand it? At the bottom of the rainbow. It'll just extend downward, okay? Further down where the rainbow ends. But if you're talking about two cities like Kfar Saba and Herzliya, and we see this all the time. I mean, here you don't really see it, but right, cities are constantly expanding their borders. Okay, if there's empty space, the city is just going to expand and take over that empty space. That's what goes on, right? So therefore, that space could be filled in by the cities, and therefore, even if it's more than 4,000, we're assuming at some point it won't be. And therefore, again, if you could kind of stick Ranana in the middle and there'd be less than 140 in between, then we view this whole thing, even if it's more than 4,000 cubits, as one gigantic city. Okay, and then you can carry, right? You can walk outside the tchum of the other city, even though you're really covering a lot of space here. So Amalei Rav Safra l'Rava. Rav Safra says to Rava, now he looks around and he says, wait a minute, there's some problem here. Hane b'nei Aktisphon, de mashchina lehu tchuma mehai gisa de Ardashir. There's Aktisphon, and Ardashir. Now the people in Ardashir walk all the way to the end of the tchum of Aktisphon and reverse. Ubnei de Ardashir mashchina lehu tchuma mehai gisa de Aktisphon. They go all the way at the end of Aktisphon. But ha'ika digla, but the Chidekel, right, I was confused. It's the Euphrates, I think. No, the blanking on my words now. But the Chidekel, right, the river there is the mafsaka ben yeter mimea va'arba'im ve'echatu shlish. So he says, thank you, the Tigris. The Tigris is more than, right? The Tigris goes in between these two cities and it's wider than 141 and 2/3. So how could, right? Doesn't that split these cities? So he asked this question to Rava, and Rava goes out. Nafik achvele, he goes out and he points out to him. This is like a good way to teach someone. Go show them. Hanach atmahata deshura mivla bediklat be'ayin amav v'shirayim. Within 70 and 2/3 amma, there were walls in the Tigris, which basically showed that there were these remains. Remember, we saw if there's something like gedudiot we saw in the Mishnah, and fall apart buildings, that you could count that as part of the city. So that basically extended the city into the river, and that's why this was all viewed as one. Okay, we'll start the next Mishnah. When they would measure, okay, they would do this 40 times. They would take a rope that was 50 cubits long, and they would basically measure that out. They would basically walk. You can see the people here in picture 213. They walk, hold it. Okay, we're going to see it now. Right? Lo pachot v'lo yoter. It has to be exactly 50. V'lo yimdod ela keneged libo. You hold it by your heart. Okay, the assumption was that we're talking about people with average height. So if you hold it by your heart and they hold it by their heart, it's going to be about even. Some people say you hold it by your heart because you can see it well there. If you hold it down or you hold it up, it might be harder to see, but different reasons as to why. What if you get to a big valley? Are you supposed to measure down into the valley? Or let's say there's a fence that like a wall that fell over and you now have a pile of rocks. Okay, so what do? You basically mavli'o v'chozer l'midato, or higia lahar mavli'o v'chozer l'midato. What do? You basically go out. Okay, this is the next picture. You go out to a space. You basically draw a straight line from where you are. You go out to a space where you can actually measure over that space. You don't measure down. You don't measure up. You basically cut across. Okay, you go to a space where you can actually measure, and then you go back. Chozer l'midato. Then you go back to the line you were at before. Okay, that's this picture. You were measuring from here, and you basically walk out to a place where you can actually get across, because here it's too wide, you can't get across. So then you walk across here, you measure your lines, and then you go back to the original line that you were at. Okay, by the way, they say you, as long as it's not outside, right? We're going to see that's the next line. You can't go so far out that you're actually outside the border, because then people will see you measuring there and they'll think it's within the tchum. It'll cause confusion. So anyway, we'll get to that, more of that tomorrow, how exactly you do the measuring. That's it for today. Have a great day, everybody.